Story number 1. The Old Joliet Prison. I had heard the stories long before I ever set foot on the grounds of the Old Joliet Prison. Stories of echoes in the halls where men had screamed their last, of footsteps that weren't there, and whispers that crawled along the walls, unsettling even the bravest of souls. But I wasn't scared. Not then. I thought they were just stories. Stories meant to scare tourists, to drum up business for the haunted house tours that seemed to thrive in every corner of this godforsaken state. But nothing prepared me for what I would find when I finally stood before those cold, crumbling walls. It's not a place you forget easily. Joliet, Illinois, isn't exactly a tourist hotspot, but the prison, the prison was infamous. Built in the mid-1800s, it had housed thousands of the worst criminals in the state. Men who were convicted of murder, robbery, and all manner of heinous crimes, locked away behind thick, iron bars that seemed to pulse with the weight of their pasts. And when it was finally abandoned in 2002, the prison's isolation gave birth to its own kind of legend. I had been working as a freelance photographer for a few years, and I'd come to hear about a group of locals who had managed to sneak inside the prison on several occasions. They claimed that the place was alive, that it breathed with the souls of the men who had once lived there. I didn't believe it. Of course, I was a man of reason, and everything I knew told me that the supernatural was just a manifestation of our fear. But fear, as it turns out, has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. The day I went was one of those autumn days where the sky was thick with clouds, and the air smelled of damp leaves and wet earth. The prison sat on the outskirts of Joliet, a hulking mass of gray stone, rusted steel, and broken windows. The once mighty walls now sagged in places, worn down by time and neglect. The perimeter was overgrown with weeds and vines, nature trying its best to reclaim what mankind had built. I didn't go alone, of course. A few friends had joined me, curious souls who wanted to see for themselves if the stories were true. There was Chris, the skeptic, who had insisted on bringing his camera to document everything scientifically. And then there was Rachel, who had a fascination with the paranormal, a girl who believed in ghosts long before I had heard of them. And me, well, I was just there for the photo op. A place like that, so steeped in history, was bound to make for an interesting shot. We parked just outside the gates, the old iron entrance creaking on its hinges as we approached. The prison stood in front of us, like a giant, dark creature hunched down, waiting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I stepped through the entrance. It was as though the air itself was different, heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. Chris was already muttering about the lack of evidence, snapping photos of the outer walls, trying to prove that everything people said about the prison was nothing more than folklore. Rachel, however, had gone quiet. I glanced over at her and saw that she was staring at the building with a faraway look in her eyes. It wasn't fear, not exactly, more like an understanding, a recognition, like she could hear something I couldn't. The inside of the prison was dark, the smell of decay and dust overwhelming. We moved through the corridors slowly, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the high, narrow halls. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the floors cracked and uneven. Every so often, the wind would howl through the broken windows, causing the old metal doors to creak and groan. But we kept moving. We reached the old cell blocks after what felt like hours. The cells were nothing but empty shells now, the bars rusted and bent, the floors covered in layers of grime and debris. But there was something about the silence there. It was too quiet. No birds sang outside. No breeze whispered through the shattered windows. It was as though time itself had stopped inside those walls. Chris was already taking more pictures, but Rachel's expression had changed. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and she was looking at something in the distance. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing. "What is it?" I asked, my voice low, trying to keep the tremor out of it. She didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, as though listening to something far off. "Do you hear that?" she finally whispered. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the wind. "Rachel," I said, but she didn't respond. She was moving toward the far end of the block now, her steps slow, deliberate. Chris didn't seem to notice, too busy with his camera. I followed her, my pulse quickening as she stepped deeper into the darkness. At the far end of the hall, there was a small courtyard. The bars of the old cells blocked our view, but Rachel had stopped just before the threshold, her back to me. "Rachel," I asked again, but this time, my voice felt far too loud. The air had thickened, grown heavy, and then I heard it, soft at first, a distant sound. It was a voice, not a whisper, but a low murmur, like someone was speaking just out of reach. My skin went cold, and I felt my heart rate spike. I looked around the courtyard, but it was empty. The sound of the voice grew louder, clearer, but it was still distant. And then, there was a sound that froze me in place. A door opening. I turned, expecting to see Chris moving into the courtyard, but there was no one there. The door had opened by itself. Rachel stepped forward. She was too close now. I reached out to grab her arm, but she shook me off. "I can hear them," she said, her voice distant, like she wasn't talking to me at all. "They're here." Before I could react, the wind howled through the courtyard. The door slammed shut, and the lights flickered. Everything went dark. I don't know how long we stood there, trapped in the pitch-black darkness. But when the lights came back on, Chris was gone. I don't mean he had wandered off, he was gone. Completely. There was no sign of him. No footprints. No trace. The sound of his camera clicking had stopped. And all that was left was the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the silence. We searched for hours, calling his name, but it was like he had never been there. Rachel wasn't the same after that. She kept whispering about the voices, about the men who had once walked these halls, the men who had never left. We never did find Chris. I left the prison that night, alone, shaken to my core. I can't explain what happened there, what I felt or saw or heard. Maybe it was all in my head, a trick of the mind. Maybe Chris had just left, pranking us somehow. But I can't shake the feeling that the old Joliet prison still holds the souls of those who died there. Men who never got a chance to escape. Men whose voices will never be quiet. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, I can still hear the echo of footsteps in the dark, the whispers of men long gone. Story number 2. The Dana Farm. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. I was young, skeptical, and stupidly confident in my own understanding of the world. I used to laugh at the idea of haunted houses, of the supernatural. All that stuff was for people who didn't know better, for the weak-hearted. I thought I had it all figured out, until I spent the night at the Dana Farm. The Dana Farm wasn't much to look at. Not really. From the outside, it looked like any other old farmhouse in Massachusetts. Weathered, the wood gray and cracked, the roof sagging in places where the wind had chewed at it over the years. The land was thick with trees, dense and impenetrable, as if nature itself was trying to keep you away. But there was something different about Dana, something I couldn't quite explain. Even now, it was the kind of place that made you feel like you were being watched. And I'm not talking about the "I'm here, you're here, we're both here" kind of feeling. No, this was the kind of feeling where you turn around and there's nothing there. But you know, deep down, you're not alone. I was just passing through, really, looking for a place to spend the night on my road trip through New England. The owner, a quiet man named Everett, had offered me a room for the night after I stopped to ask for directions. He didn't say much, just nodded when I asked if there were any good places to eat in the area. When I mentioned I was a photographer, he told me I could stay in the guest room on the second floor, the room that faced the back fields. It was a good deal, too good, if I'm being honest. I should have known something was off from the way he didn't make eye contact when he spoke to me, but I shrugged it off. I had my camera with me, and the idea of getting some cool shots of an old farmstead sounded like a nice way to end the day. As I walked up the creaky staircase to the guest room, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you feel like you're waiting for something to happen. The air inside the house was thick, almost oppressive, as if it had been trapped here for years. I set my bag down on the bed and opened the window, hoping the fresh air would help clear the strange heaviness in the room. That's when I saw it, or I should say, them, in the distance, just beyond the field. I saw what looked like small lights flickering. First, I thought it was the reflection of a car's headlights, but as I stared longer, I realized there were no cars, no roads leading that way. The lights moved, slowly, as if they were being carried by some unseen hand. They drifted across the field, hovering above the ground, circling around in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me, or maybe I had seen too many horror movies in my time. But something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't just my imagination. I decided to go outside to investigate. Maybe I could get a good shot, or maybe I was just stupid enough to think I could make sense of what I had seen. I grabbed my camera and stepped out onto the porch, the chill of the night air biting into my skin. The lights were still there, glowing softly, moving in that same eerie pattern. I walked toward the edge of the field, every step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath me. As I got closer to the lights, I noticed something else. The silence, the absolute, suffocating silence, had deepened. It was as if the night had swallowed all sound, all life. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing, just the distant glow and the thumping of my own heartbeat in my ears. I stepped into the field, the grass crunching under my boots, and that's when I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, a whisper. First, I thought it was the wind, but then the whisper became clearer. It was a voice, but it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, guttural, almost like it was coming from the ground itself. Leave. Leave now, or you'll never leave. I froze. My blood went cold. I spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. No one except for me and the flickering lights. I turned and started walking back to the house, faster now, my pulse racing in my chest. As I reached the porch, I felt something watching me, presence, cold and heavy, standing just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing, but I knew, I felt it. Something was there, something in the dark. Inside the house, I bolted the door, but the unease didn't leave me. The silence was suffocating, and the air was thick with something that I couldn't name. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, made my heart race. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, closing in on me, and then I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. First, I thought it was just the branches of a tree moving in the wind, but when the tapping came again, I knew it wasn't the wind. I grabbed my camera, heart pounding in my chest. I approached the window slowly, carefully. My hand trembled as I lifted the curtain just a little, and that's when I saw her, a woman, dressed in white, her face pale and ghostly, floating just beyond the glass. Her eyes, those eyes were black, hollow pits of emptiness. She stared at me, unblinking, her mouth moving as if she was saying something, though I couldn't hear her voice. I stumbled back, the camera slipping from my hands, and crashed to the floor. The tapping stopped, but the feeling didn't. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. The next morning, when I tried to leave, Everett wasn't there. No one was. The house was empty, the windows dark, as if it had never been lived in. I left Dana Farm that morning, my mind reeling from what I'd seen and what I'd heard. The road ahead was long, but every mile that passed didn't make the feeling of that place go away. Every moment felt like I was being pulled back toward it, toward that cursed field, toward the flickering lights and the whispers in the dark. Some places, some farms, they don't let go. They hold you. And Dana Farm? Well, it still has its grip on me. Because I know deep down that the lights, the sounds, and the woman in white, they're still there, waiting. Story number 3. The Biltmore Estate. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting to see anything. I'm not the type of person who jumps at shadows or flinches at strange noises in the night. I didn't believe in ghosts, not until I stepped onto the grounds of the Biltmore Estate. Now, before you dismiss me as some conspiracy theorist or paranormal enthusiast, let me say this. I'm just a man with a camera and a curiosity for the unknown. I was there on assignment for a local magazine, nothing more, nothing less. We were writing about the history of the Biltmore, its construction, its legacy as the largest privately owned home in America. The architecture was grand, the grounds lush, the whole place felt like something straight out of a fairy tale. But it wasn't the mansion's beauty that kept me up at night. The Biltmore Estate sits on thousands of acres in Asheville, North Carolina. It's breathtaking, impressive, even intimidating with its stone walls that rise like a fortress and its towering spires that reach for the sky. It's a place where old money and new wealth collide, where the Vanderbilt family built their dream and, in doing so, created something that would linger far longer than they could ever imagine. I remember the first time I walked through the front gates, the ironwork twisting and curving like a spider's web. It was late autumn. The trees in the surrounding forest splashed with red and gold, their leaves carpeting the ground in a riot of color. The estate was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I walked through the grand entrance of the mansion, the scent of polished wood and antique furniture heavy in the air. Everything was pristine, as if time had been frozen here, not just in the architecture but in the very spirit of the place. The staff, most of them seemed friendly enough, though there was a certain distance in their eyes, the kind of distance you get when you've seen something you can't explain, something you'd rather forget. It wasn't long before I heard the rumors. The house, they said, was haunted, not by the usual kind of ghosts you hear about, none of the usual tales of tragic deaths or vengeful spirits. No, the Biltmore was haunted by something more elusive, something that slipped through the cracks of the past like a cold breeze. I didn't believe it at first. I mean, sure, the place was old, really old, and maybe there was a bit of an eerie atmosphere when you wandered the halls after dark. But nothing that would make me want to pack up and leave. That was until I heard her. I was on a late tour one evening, alone, just me and the guide, an older woman named Evelyn. She had worked at the Biltmore for years, long enough to know its secrets. We were walking through the grand hallway when she stopped. Suddenly, her face going pale. "You hear that?" she asked. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the creaking of the house settling, the faint whisper of wind through the walls. But then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, caught it, a soft melody, a piano playing somewhere deep within the house. I asked Evelyn if the staff ever heard anything like it before. She nodded slowly, her eyes darkening. "It's her," she whispered, "the woman in white." Evelyn told me the story of a woman who once lived in the estate, Clara Vanderbilt, a relative of the family who'd once been married to a man named Henry. He was a successful banker, but the marriage had never been a happy one. Clara spent most of her days wandering the mansion, playing the piano in the grand music room while her husband was away on business. Some nights, she'd stay up until dawn, playing the same sad song over and over. People say the song was about loss, about the loss of love, about the loss of time. Clara died young. Some say of a broken heart. Others say it was a tragic accident. No one really knows for sure. But the strange thing was, after her death, the piano continued to play. Staff would hear it in the dead of night, the same haunting melody, as though Clara's spirit had never really left. I didn't believe it, not at first. I thought maybe it was just the acoustics of the house playing tricks, the wind shifting through the pipes or the floorboards. But the more I walked the halls, the more I heard it. Sometimes, it was faint, like a distant memory. Other times, it was sharp and clear, cutting through the stillness of the house. Then, it happened. I was walking through the upstairs hallway, near the guest suites. The house was empty, silent except for the occasional squeak of the floor beneath my feet. That's when I saw her. A woman, dressed in white, her long, flowing gown billowing around her like mist. She was standing by one of the windows, staring out at the gardens below. Her face was pale, her hair dark and tangled. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I might faint, but then she turned, just enough for me to catch the glint of something in her eyes. It was then that I realized she wasn't just a vision. She wasn't just a trick of the light. She was real. But as soon as I took a step toward her, she vanished, gone, no trace, like she'd never been there at all. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been staring too long at the wallpaper, or maybe the shadows in the hallway played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew she had been there, and I knew the others had seen her too. That's when the stories started flooding in. The staff, people who had worked here for years, told me about the strange sounds they'd heard at night, the soft creak of floorboards, the rustling of skirts, the far-off echoes of a piano playing in the empty halls. Some of them had seen her, too, the woman in white, gliding silently through the halls, never saying a word. No one knows exactly who she is, or what keeps her tethered to the estate. Maybe she's a part of the house itself, woven into its walls, into its very bones. Or maybe she's a remnant of something lost, someone forgotten, drifting between the world of the living and the dead. I've left the Biltmore many times since that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of her presence. The way the house seemed to breathe around me. The next time I went back, I didn't see her again, but I could still hear the piano, faintly, echoing in the distance. And I know, in my bones, that she's still there, somewhere in the dark corners of the Biltmore, playing her lonely tune, forever,